Welcome to the May 23rd, 2023 City Council Work Session. I'd like to turn it over to City Manager Benda to walk us through the agenda overview.
Thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council. Good afternoon. Today's agenda, the work session itself, there are no pressing topics to engage you and your peers upon. Business item briefings, those are those elements to remind those that are here and watching. We try to first inform council and give them opportunity to understand what's coming ahead of them so that the next time that they meet, you will have been briefed and have an opportunity then to vote. We don't want to marry the two together, so we have a couple of those this afternoon, Madam Mayor, and then there are a couple closed session items, and with that, I turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. So our first business item briefing will be number one, the citywide youth curfew. Mr. Benda.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, again, Vice Mayor, members of City Council. At one of our most recent meetings, and I think it was the most immediate one, Mr. Taylor asked me to look at a curfew and talk with city staff. And Mr. Mischens had sent around, and maybe some of you had sent other copies of ordinances or resolutions of curfews here in the state. Some of the examples were from Danville, Charlottesville, what have you. And so together with the Commonwealth's attorney, with the police department, the sheriff's office, the list is long, and I'm going to forget somebody, so I'm going to stop there. Needless to say, everyone got together, rolled up their sleeves, and worked really hard together with our city attorney to ensure that what we positioned before you this afternoon, is something that you guys can review. In its basic form is anyone under 18, the curfew is proposed from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. There are other provisions in there, certain exceptions, certain kind of elements, but I just position that as just kind of the broadest overarching. There are many more people here that can speak particularly to and have, if you have questions, they can talk it through with you. In the draft ordinance that was sent to staff, and in reviewing it, there was a proposed term of six months. It was to the end of December of 2023. I don't know if you saw, but there was a University of Lynchburg professor who opined on curfews, and that was in the newspaper, and some of the feedback, I know that from our Commonwealth's attorney, from our police department, some others, there's a consideration as to whether or not to extend it longer so that you get a larger data set. So this afternoon, something to consider is whether or not 6 months to a year, and for us, we can go with either. Also, considering, and good news, again, precipitation-wise, we didn't see much snow this year, and as a result, I don't know if you paid attention, I have kids in Lynchburg City Schools. They shortened the term, so my senior, her last day was this past Monday, much to our joy and what have you, and then our middle daughter, who's in middle school, her last day is the 26th. And so, again, remember the definition I gave of a business item briefing is that we want to brief you, not put you in a position to vote on anything that same day, but considering school is ending, if we want to look at implementation of this resolution this afternoon, it's something for consideration that you and your peers could put it on general business for this evening to vote upon it. Not anything that was stressed. Your next meeting is June 13th, so there'll be that kind of time if you wanted to take that time before voting. So, Madam Mayor, that's a broad explanation of what's before council today. There are many more people here that are prepared to answer any questions if you so choose. Otherwise, I turn it back to you and your peers.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm sure there's discussion on this. Who would like to start? Mr. Taylor?
Well, I'd like to see the curfew implemented as soon as possible. Yesterday.
Do you have any questions for anybody present?
No.
Okay.
We spoke it.
Okay.
And seems like city manager wants to push it forward.
Okay.
And that's what we're going to do.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? Councilman Hutchinson?
So maybe Bethany can, thank you for all your help, Bethany, on all this and drafting it and looking at all the different other options and coming up with a good resolution. It looks like a couple things were just left out of there, and what we wanted, I think, as Mr. Taylor just stated, I think school gets out May 26th officially. So if we have the start date be May 26th, and then the end date, that's the sunset period, that would be an item number 2, to have it expire on December 1st of this year, so we can have a test case, and not having something go on forever. And obviously, if it's good, we'll hear back. And I think this, maybe you can just, it gives an extra tool for our law enforcement officers to help get violent gang members off the street, I think. Is that?
Yes, Mayor Reed and Councilmember Hegelson, this is just a tool. It's not a cure-all.
Yep.
We know a number of other cities have curfews, and some information, that article that came out that the city manager referenced, just discussed, the ordinances as effective as you enforce it as far as its utility. So, the chief of police, Ryan Zudema, can speak to, his thoughts about the implementation of the ordinance. But in my many conversations with him, it's my understanding this is not like a primary enforcement objective here. It's a tool in the toolbox.
Absolutely.
Just like you would have a number of tools, a hammer, a screwdriver, all these things, and you might have a wire stripper. A wire stripper has a very specific use. A curfew would have a very specific use. It's not, a multi-tool to use in every moment. But having it for this time period, and from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m., we see juvenile crime, different hours of the day. We certainly see it late afternoon into the night, and we definitely see it after 11 p.m., between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. And I think it's worded in such a way as to be manageable. It tracks the Charlottesville ordinance that's been in place for a number of years now. And also the idea being that you also have provisions in here. So for example, on the definition of parents, referencing that if someone 18 years of age or older is with the juvenile or juveniles standing in loco parentis or as the parent, they would still have to have written authorization from the parent, because we want to make sure we're not providing a breeding ground for older gang members to take advantage of our vulnerable youth who may be out and without supervision. I envision this being used in such a manner. For example, someone calls in and says there's car break-ins going up and down the street. When police arrive at the scene, unless they have reasonable suspicion to stop, a group of folks who may be out there, if it's between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., the officers can get out and have what they call consensual encounter. They can just, say, hey, do you mind talking to us? If people say no and they take off, there's not a whole lot they can do, with some exceptions. But with this, it appears to be minors, that they do have a tool to get out with them and figure out why are you out here right now and send them on their way home. I think that's the primary, is we want you to go home. We want you to be safe. If it develops into something else, if they see a weapon concealed on the person, or maybe develop other facts that perhaps they are involved with the criminal activity, then it can go in that path. Again, this is not to just turn into a police state and really, trying to heavily enforce curfew, but just another tool in the toolbox to use towards crime prevention.
Good. Sounds good. And I do hope that we bring this up tonight to finalize it. So the only two things that we've changed so far are the beginning time, which is starting either, I guess, either tonight or when school gets out in 3 days, and then ending, sunsetting December 1st.
Dr. Wilder?
Yeah, thank you so much for the information. Thank you for preparing this document. I appreciate it. Just a couple of questions. Now, I've received so much information in reference to curfews and the effectiveness of it, or ineffectiveness of it. What studies have y'all shown that shows it is the effective method?
Okay. I don't have any of that data, and my understanding is that you as City Council would like some data back on that. Now, we don't, in my office, we're not on the front end of the enforcement, so I think that would be up to the police department to perhaps track that information. And I think that's why with a short period of time to see the effectiveness if it's used, in what ways, perhaps what comes out of it. It's my understanding, much like we read in that article that came out Sunday in the News in Advance, that it really depends on how it's used. So you have some jurisdictions that have the curfew, but they're not really enforcing it. So there's not really data coming from those. But you have other cities who do use it. I know we had our work session just talking about safe summer plans. I'm going to again reference Chief Zudema, who had some information from other localities for those who do enforce it. It's not like a lot. I think he said for Danville, it was like 6 to 10 times a year they may have a curfew violation, something of that nature.
Okay, thank you. Again, I have a question for Chief Zudema. Thank you so much. One comment that I've received that says that sometimes it's more enforced in the low income or impoverished communities, so it's kind of targeting them more. So what direction are we giving to our officers So it's not targeting certain persons or certain because of their skin color, just to make sure we're being equal in this measurement tool.
And again, I think it's another good question for our
Yeah,
Chief of
yes.
Police, if you don't mind me
Yes,
deferring to
ma'am.
him.
Yes,
Sorry.
good. Yes.
Madam Mayor, Mr. Vice Mayor, members of the council, so we focus on behavior and actions. We don't focus on appearance or neighborhood or things like that. So all of our officers, regardless of whether it's curfew, whether it's enforcement of any type of criminal activity, is absolutely on the activity that's taking place and the behavior, not necessarily on the appearance. Our direction has not gone out to our officers yet because we needed to make sure that we knew exactly what the ordinance says or doesn't say before it goes out. That's a piece of that, is training our officers to make sure they understand what the ordinance is, what it allows them to do, what it doesn't allow to do. There's certainly an educational piece that we'll want to push out. I know we'll work with Ms. Benson and her staff to push that out to the community, but we're going to be focusing on actions of individuals, not necessarily on appearances or where they live or where they may be at.
Another question, it was, as far as looking at the punishment, it's like, it says possibly a misdemeanor, and also kind of getting more information from the child to see why they're out kind of thing, and then getting the contacting the guardian. So is there there's no financial penalties to the parents?
So, and I'll speak first, and then I'll certainly let Bethany or Matt correct anything I state. But our goal, if we're, let's say it's past right now, and tonight at 1 o'clock in the morning, my officers see a group of 3 individuals who appear to be under the age of 18 walking down the street with backpacks on, looking in cars, right? That is a tool for them to stop them, detain them. The first thing they're going to do is determine their age. Right? Because short of anything other behavior, if it's just a curfew violation, which is why they're stopping them and detaining them, they've got to determine if that person is of age. And if that person is 18, then short of something else being there allowing them to detain them, they're going to cut them loose and send them on their way. Our goal with this is not to see how many people we can arrest for curfew violations, right? And I don't honestly think, we'll certainly track that, but I don't think that's a good metric of seeing how effective this is. To answer your other question before, I think the metrics to track this is juvenile crime, is that going up or down, right? Victimization as well, because I think Ms. Harrison alluded to it. Part of this goal is to get some of our at-risk youth who are maybe on that fence, who don't have a lot of parental guidance or direction, off the streets during those hours, so we don't have gang members trying to bring them into other criminal behavior. So we'll track victimization of youth, we'll track those who are committing those crimes, right? And then we're going to track how many times our officers actually use this ordinance to get out and stop somebody, to detain them, to determine what they're up to and things like that. So I hope that answers that. As far as the fine piece, I believe, and Bethany, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Class 4 misdemeanor piece would be for the parents. I think for a juvenile, it's more or less a juvenile violation. And I can tell you from talking to Stephanie Meehan, who is our local director of court services here for J&D court, or juvenile court, she says, if we bring curfew in front of them for a individual who does not have any other involvement in the juvenile court system, those are going to be deferred outside of the court into other programs they have to try and see what else they can do to help this child and this family. So again, this is not a heavy-handed ordinance where we come in and see how many people we can lock up. Not my goal, and I don't think the goal of anybody that's been involved with it. It's just exactly as, I won't repeat everything that the Commonwealth Attorney said, it's a tool to give our officers, to allow them to try and address some of the violent crime that we're seeing being committed by, perpetrated by, and unfortunately sometimes against juveniles in the community. And if I misstated any of that, please, on the fine.
No, that's good. You did.
Thank you.
And do you anticipate it being an extra burden on our police officers? I know we're short and all that kind of thing, but is that going to be a major extra burden for our police staff, or?
So it's a two-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, is it another ordinance for them to look at enforcing? Yes. But by enforcing that, does it also potentially diminish other police work that they have to do? Yes. So that's a balance that we'll certainly work through. We're going to make sure we educate our folks. And it's going to be like everything else we do. We prioritize what we do. If there's a shooting that's going on, or there's a violent crime going on, and there's a group of 2 or 3 juveniles, or appear to be juveniles on the street corner, my resources are going to go to the violent crime, right? Where that is not. But when there are times where my officers have the ability to have free time to be proactive, that's when they're going to be looking to use this ordinance to make sure that they're identifying those individuals. Again, we're talking about a very small segment of even our juvenile population that's involved in this type of activity, and we want to be able to use this tool to go in there and kind of weed them out.
Thank you. I think it's important for our community to understand this training coming involved. It's not a method of just, like you said, making it a state of arresting on like children. So it's more so a tool in your toolkit to make sure that it's not targeting certain people, but you said targeting certain behaviors, things of that nature, that you have another toolkit. It's not to overburden our police officers, but to give you another tool that you can use to help supervise our streets. So that's what to kind of assure the community and assure parents. I would like to have had more input from parents, because this has been a kind of short time window. So I would like to have had more input from parents. I did send some of the drafts out to some community members just to get some ideas and get some thoughts. But I would like to have had more of a longer time to get more input from our community, from our parents. But at least I did get some when I sent it out. So I did get some comments, the ones that I asked today from various persons. So I understand the need for it, but also to make sure that community understands there's training involved. The basis that you kind of give me today kind of answers a lot of the questions that people asked me about. Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you.
So my question would be for Bethany, and it has to do with the fines, I think we talked about that, but I don't see it in the ordinance now.
I'm sorry.
About the fines, whether or not,
So it is a class 4 misdemeanor, and that would be for anyone, whether juvenile or adult. So for adults, you are issued a summons. So think about kind of like traffic enforcement. You're issued a summons, and it's a little different. It's a traffic infraction. It's punishable by a fine only, not by jail at all. For the juvenile, also punishable by a fine, except juveniles are treated differently in the Juvenile Domestic Relations Court. So it's considered an act of juvenile delinquency. As the chief said, our Director of Court Services or Director of Juvenile Probation has said that if she gets a curfew violation that comes in, her first priority is to divert them outside of the court system. And there's a number of programs that they can send kids to not even have it come before a judge. But if it is a kid who has already had some problems, maybe truancy, different things going on, where they think, this child should go before the judge, or we don't have any programs that can address this issue that we see, then it can go before the judge. And again, it's a finable offense, but the judges in the Juvenile Domestic Relations Court have a little more leeway as far as what they can order, because a big priority of the Juvenile Domestic Relations Court is rehabilitation of the juvenile.
thank you.
So I do have a few questions. I think expectation management is important, so I think if y'all would both just stay up here for a couple questions. One is, I understand 6 months has been recommended or suggested. My question would be, do we feel like with the trends that we see through the year with, I guess all crimes in the city, but even with juvenile-related crimes, do you think that 6 months is a fair amount of time to test this, or do you think a full year would be a better length of time to really see, with the trends that we see, a better test period?
I'll just say from my perspective, I think the city manager alluded to it, a longer window gives you a larger data set. It also gives you all of the seasons of the year. We got traditionally, and speaking very anecdotally in some senses, we see an increase in certain types of activity during summer months and a decrease in other types of activity during the winter months. So a larger data set would help, and it would also cover all of the other variables that you could factor in. If it's a 6-month window, you're maybe not factoring in certain breaks from school, right? That you're dealing with a good portion of that summer that is our juveniles are out without school, whereas if we did a year long, you might get a little bit better. So it's certainly, we'll work with whatever council ultimately decides to do on that. And one thing I wanted to state that I apologize, I forgot to state earlier, is in talking to Ms. Meehan with Court Services, this is another tool that she can use as well. So she has a very small list of very violent young men and women, right, who are already on probation in the juvenile court system, who are involved in some serious crimes already. If we see one of them out, they already have a condition, right, that says they can't be out past whatever hour as a part of their probation. But right now, we don't necessarily have, short of knowing that, Stephanie Reed is that juvenile that is out there, we don't necessarily have the ability to do that. Whereas this will allow us to get out with those individuals. And if we find that's on her list, we'll contact our intake officer right away. They will violate that young man or young woman right away based on all the other stuff they're already on probation for. So it gives her another tool to deal with what I would argue are the worst of the worst, right? Those individuals who are committing these violent crimes as juveniles that we don't want out running around on our streets.
Okay, thank you. So my next question would be, I guess, again, so walking out this scenario, again, for the purpose of expectation management, because I think what we want it to do, and what maybe people are expecting it to do, and what the reality of it might do, and needs to be explored and thought about. So right now, it's after 11 p.m., you see some people that look like they are under 18, and now your officers have the right to stop them because of the curfew. You stop them, you're allowed to ask them their age. If they are underage and they don't have a destination to go to, they don't have a reason for being out, they're violating the rules of the curfew, then they now have to get home. You call parents, you call guardians, right? And they now have to answer for their child or whoever they're in custody of. If there is not a parent or custody or guardian available, then what's the process?
Yeah, so we would work with other service providers we have in the community, no different than right now. You know, there's occasionally times where we come across juveniles that are out. We interact with them for reasons other than a curfew violation. There's no adult there. We would try and contact some type of a family member that we could track down if we couldn't, and it was an absolute worst case scenario. In 90% of the time or more, we're able to do that. We could certainly contact our social services department, other folks, to see if they have other options for us to do that. There's certainly an option for a CHINS petition. That is a child in need of services. It's not specific to curfew violations. It's just a child that doesn't have the ability to care for themselves and is out or in a position where they're not being cared for. Those are pretty rare. And again, in that scenario you provide, the goal again is to further investigate, right? We determine they're under 18, and then we say, why are you out here? What are you doing? Where are you coming from? All these types of things. And if we determine they're not involved in any type of criminal activity, you know, the overwhelming majority of the time, we're going to call a parent, exactly as you said, or a guardian, whoever that may be, and get them back home and help educate that parent or guardian that, hey, this individual, your child, or whoever you were responsible for, cannot be out during these hours anymore. And if they are, both you and the child run the risk of being charged with that. So.
Okay. And then in the worst case scenario, that it is someone like you just mentioned that has someone that you know has a history, it's someone that knows they shouldn't be out, and they become a problem. Let's say they take off running. Can you play out that scenario?
Yeah, so you know that, like any time our officers are involved in interactions like that, they have to make a decision, often kind of split second. And if it's no other type of criminal activity afoot, and a juvenile takes off running, they're certainly going to try and stop that individual, but they're not going to. You know, we're not going to pull 12 officers off the street to stop answering calls so we can track down a 17-year-old that ran into the woods that isn't committing any other type of crime, that just got scared or whatever. But if it's that worst of the worst individual that you're talking about, certainly we're going to take every step we can and use the resources we have available to track that person down, bring them into custody so we can get them in front of court services and get them violated for being out after a condition of their probation already says they can't be, and now they're violating the curfew on top of that.
Right. Just because the information that I've read has been kind of, I think we've all read different sides of it, which says it's a good goal, and I think we all agree it's something we definitely want to try, and we're hoping we'll see some positive response from it. But the other side is, I think the community needs to know that we may or may not see. We have to give it time to see what'll come from it, and understanding that, we hope that it'll cause a slowing down of these crimes that are happening at the hands of the youth, and that hopefully the accountability and the consequences will be enough to maybe cause some kids to say no or redirect, but we don't always know. So I'm just curious as what your opinion was as far as the length of time and the data collection, and then just really kind of playing out the scenario as well. I think the only other question I had was, I think that there was, Mr. Friedman, an amendment that was made to the ordinance. Would you mind commenting on that?
Yes, ma'am. The amendment that was made, it was made at before it was posted on the agenda, but what had originally been sent to council and what had been floating around was a version of the Charlottesville ordinance, but it had excluded an exception that accounted for First Amendment rights, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly and speech. The reason I had given the recommendation that be included in there is, one, it was in the Charlottesville ordinance. The Charlottesville ordinance had passed constitutional muster when it was appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the court had noted several times throughout that opinion essentially how important it was, or how I don't know how to better describe it, but that they liked the fact that it was in there. And that's important because certainly if the constitutionality of this ordinance was challenged, we want to be able to follow precedent of what has been set by the court, and that's why I had suggested that be put back in there.
Okay. Thank you. Vice Mayor Feraldi?
You play out this situation, Chief Zudema, that you just described. Because knowing myself at the age of 15 or 16, I could be a little bit sharp in a negative way. So what I had heard you say was, if I'm stopped and I just run, I've done nothing else, there's not going to be much of an effort to come after me. Is that what you communicated?
Hate to say this, but it depends. It depends on all of the things the officer observed prior to getting out with you. It depends on what the officer observed as he or she was getting out with you. It depends on the officer's knowledge of you individually, if they know any type of previous criminal behavior you've been involved in. It depends on the location of where it takes place. If we're having a lot of problems in that area with car break-ins or burglaries or violent crime or whatever it may be, the officer's going to have to take the totality of all that into his or her mind and make a judgment call, which is exactly what we ask them to do every day they get out on any type of call right now, and make a determination on, do I need to be going after this person right now, or do I not? And the general assessment of that is going to be up to the officer based on all those things they have to take into consideration as they make those decisions.
How does a 14 or 15-year-old provide documentation as to their age?
So that's a good question. A lot of times that's going to be through contacting a parent regardless, because they're already out after curfew, right? And if they don't have some means of doing that, whether it's through a school ID, I know some schools issue, some don't, is what I'm being told.
I don't have it on me. I can't produce it.
Right. So, until we can prove you're 18, we're going to contact someone who can prove you're 18. So we're going to reach out to parent, family member, whoever it may be. Again,
Forgive me, I'm going to be a little bit of a teenager for a moment, so I don't mean it disrespectfully. I'm not giving you my cell phone.
Okay, and that's fine. Then we'll take you into custody and we'll get a chins petition for you until we can determine your age. And that's something that's completely within our ability to do. We deal with adults right now every day who refuse to give their name. We take them to the jail and we book them under John Doe, and they stay that way until we're able to identify them for whatever offenses that we're charging them with.
Why is it a misdemeanor 4, not 3?
I did not draft the ordinance, so you'd probably have to speak to somebody who was involved in that. Our part's just to do the enforcement piece, not the drafting of it.
As point, class 3 is also just a fine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's up to $500.
Yeah, state code authorizes localities to go up to a class 3. I'm just asking why we're not doing a class 3 versus 4.
If that was just tracking Charlottesville, if that was a choice. Okay.
It's my understanding when the original draft was sent out, City Council was trying to track the Charlottesville ordinance. So that was the penalties, I understand it, was in the Charlottesville ordinance.
For reference, folks, the difference between the two would be a up to $250 fine versus up to a $500 fine. Can you speak to this part of the language where it says, this is on the last page after the reference of Virginia code, where required the officer will release the minor to their parents? What does that mean?
Give me 1 second. I just want to read the whole section so I have context for it.
Because under the situation I just played out a little bit, I was walking up the street off of Ford Avenue, and I didn't give you my identification. I'm not giving you my phone number. Under that, you're taking me into custody until you can figure out who I am, when legitimately I've done nothing, and now, where required, I'll be turned back to my parents.
Yeah, so I pause you on that I've done nothing. If you're out past 11 o'clock and you're not an adult, you have done something, you violated our curfew, and until we can determine that, our officer's gonna have to make an assessment, right? We all know that there's plenty of 15-year-olds, right, that maybe look like they're 25, and there may be plenty of 25-year-olds that look like they're 15. We just have to use reasonable articulable suspicion and make an assessment or a judgment on that. And, so we're gonna make that assessment. The way I interpret that last statement that you're asking about under I think it's G as in George 1 for minors, where required, the officer will release the minor to the parents. So the way I would interpret that is if we are not going to seek some type of curfew violation that would require us to take that individual in front of the juvenile domestic relations court or an on-call person, which would be at night, that we would then certainly be required to release that person, because if they're out past a curfew, they're in violation of that. The only way they become not in violation of that is to have an adult or responsible guardian or someone that is in loco parentis to be in charge of that person and give them back to them.
In the sentence prior, it says, then the officer, if such an investigation reveals that such and such happened, the officer may charge the minor with a violation of the section and may issue summons requiring the minor to appear in court. I have two questions. I had heard from a previous question that the parent will be cited with the fine, and then I read this. Can we get some clarity on that? And secondly, why are we saying may to the officer as opposed to shall?
I think I'll talk about the first part. So there are specific provisions in this ordinance that talk about the parental responsibilities. So if the minor is out and I think the parent doesn't know about it, that's where the parent would not necessarily be charged. If the parent is kind of condoning the violation of curfew, or you have other adults condoning it, or I think you even have, I think there's a third category of persons in here, that those people can also be charged with a class 4 misdemeanor. So I think that's why you have that difference in language. But as far as the may cite them, I'll leave that to the chief.
Yeah, and I will tell you, that was my recommendation to change shall to may. The original draft had shall. Shall does not give an officer any discretion, which means we will lock up and arrest every juvenile that is out between 11 and 5, period, if they are not within one of these exceptions. That is not what I think we need to be doing as a police department or as a community. And you may all think differently, and ultimately, if you pass it with shall, then that's what it is. But I do not think that was the intention of this. I think the intention of this was to give us a tool. Shall does not give us any flexibility. The reference I will give you is when I started law enforcement in 1997, domestic violence laws were much different. The officer had discretion, basically, in a domestic violence case, whether he or she wanted to arrest who they thought was the individual that was responsible for that. The laws changed in early 2000s, probably, Bethany, that said the law enforcement officers, upon conducting domestic violence investigation, shall, if they can, determine who the predominant aggressor is in domestic violence. They shall arrest, meaning if you determine that this individual assaulted this person in a domestic violence case, you have to, by law, arrest them. There's no discretion there. I just don't think for an ordinance of this nature on a class 4 misdemeanor that we need to have shall language in there. That was my suggestion, but ultimately, obviously, it's at the leisure of council.
What's our purpose then with establishing a curfew if we'll enforce it here but not there?
Not sure I'm trying.
What's our purpose with the curfew if we're gonna say we'll enforce it here but not there?
So if I'm thinking, for tracking what the police chief explained, gives him the same discretion he's talking about. And again, if you listen.
I recognize that.
Yeah, the
I'm
Commonwealth
asking
attorney.
why? Why are we saying we're gonna have a rule if we're gonna have exceptions for some and not all? Or some and not all?
Well, there are exceptions in the statute already that say if you're out and you're under 18, but there are certain exceptions to why you're out, that gives you the provision to be out after that time period.
Sure, but then when it comes to anything else outside of those exceptions, I as never would do it, because these folks are brave, much braver than I.
Sure.
Officer Feraldi can make a decision that it's little Johnny, I know him, he's fine, I'll let him go.
Comes back to the totality of the circumstances, and I think
The
those-
totality of the circumstances that there are 12 and 13-year-olds shooting up houses and a 6-year-old was killed in his bed playing video games. So I'm asking.
Sure, and so, Mr. Vice Mayor, what I come back to is what the police chief said. So if what the council wants is a shall as opposed to a may, we certainly can move in that direction. But I would lean to support what the police chief is saying, that that police officer, he or she that's in that circumstance, in that area with that person, that maybe understands what's happening, I too would support may as opposed to shall. But again, to you and your peers' pleasure as to how it should be drafted.
Yeah, I appreciate the back and forth on it. I struggle with this because of the effectiveness of what we're talking about. I did a lot of digging into data, and there's, as was noted, how effective is it because of how to the T are we going to follow this? One of the questions I did have that I didn't ask was, how, with what tenacity, with what intensity are we going to enforce this? Throw in may versus shall, and then all of a sudden, what are we building this on, and is it going to accomplish what we're trying to do? That's kind of where I've been bouncing. I had a conversation with some of my colleagues over the phone, and initially I was supportive of going this direction, but the more and more I dug into it, I've come across bigger and bigger questions that are a cause of concern for me.
So to that end,
Play out the scenario if they don't stop is one. I start running away. I'm not going to pursue this because it's a $250 fine. Or I decline to pursue them for whatever may shall articulate, and then that is also the kid who does the next shooting in Lynchburg because we didn't take them. I think there are some civil liberty issues. I think there's an effectiveness issue that I really wasn't aware of until I really dug into this from my perspective. And so, we can put it to a vote tonight, but I do think on a couple levels, if we're going to talk about doing this, we should do it to the greatest extent with the ability under the law, and that's Class 3 versus Class 4, and that's if we should do it. And then secondly, I think we should be looking more into strategically going after violent crime, not after a small segment of the population that sure is causing problems, but I think that's a byproduct of a larger issue in the city. And candidly, as much as I appreciate where we've gotten to this point, I don't know if Charlottesville's the foundation for where we should be as far as a safe community.
Well, and Madam Mayor, if I may, the only thing I would add, as it relates to the ordinance, the benefit of going by the Charlottesville ordinance is it's essentially tried and true through the federal court with constitutionality. That's the benefit for basing a skeleton, if you will, off a curfew ordinance for the city. As the police chief and Ms. Harrison had said, I don't think the end goal here is to cite left and right for curfew violations, but again, to have a tool in the toolbox as it relates to having reasonable articulable suspicion to stop people who may be in violation of the curfew, and then determine whether there's further criminal violations or further criminal activity that's afoot. And I guess certainly changing may versus shall is in the discretion of council, but I don't think doing that would really change the intended purpose of the ordinance.
Thank you. Here's as I was listening to Vice Mayor Frawley talk, and again, you guys may get tired of me speaking from this perspective, but as a mother, I can't help it, especially as the mother of a couple of teenagers. I guess my concern is what I don't want to happen is to put your officers in the position to have to choose to take the lives of teenagers because of the curfew. I know the intent of this curfew is to try to keep them from committing crimes in our city, and we're trying to save these teenagers. Really, ultimately, they don't understand that, but that's what we're really trying to do here, is we're trying to save them from themselves. We're trying to save them from these gangs, trying to save them from committing crimes by taking the lives of other innocent people, which we've unfortunately seen happen recently. So I understand the intent, but I also, as you were talking, don't want to put officers in the position to have to chase people down that are youth because they're whatever, fill in the blank. They're worried about the fine. They're scared about getting caught because they're whatever the reason. And we can talk about the fact that they have made a lot of bad decisions, but that is something to consider. I also would like to ask about, and I'm not saying that they're going to do that, so please understand what I'm saying. It's something to think about, though, because I do think about the position that your officers are put on in the daily basis as well, and what this can do to them and having to make those split-second decisions that they have to make every single day, and that these are still children when they're under 18, even when they're 18, we know at our age they look like children still too. So it's still something to consider. What do you see the impact of this potentially having on our juvenile detention center with this curfew? I mean, do you see that potentially increasing the numbers at our detention center based on some of this?
Probably something that would have to be answered by the court services unit, but again, my conversation and the Commonwealth Attorney's conversation with Stephanie Meehan has been that, the overwhelming majority of these that are, if they are charged with a curfew violation, short of having a prior juvenile criminal history, these are never even going to get into the true court system. They're going to go through diversion, which means they're going to get, instead of going in front of a judge, these are going to go in front of a variety of other programs that the court services unit has for both the involved juvenile and oftentimes for the parents as well, whether it's, parenting skills or making sure the kid has opportunities to be involved in, education or job or whatever it may be. So the majority of these, I would contend, are probably never going to make it into the court system, so they shouldn't impact the juvenile detention center.
Right.
Other than, again, the worst of the worst who are already on probation for something else. This is a way to violate them if they are out after curfew.
Right.
But yeah, again, I think the majority of the ones we come across would probably not fit that mold.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Councilman Mischins?
Got a couple questions, I think, possibly for all three of you, but I'll just go ahead and start with you, Chief, since you're up there. So the first question that concerns me, and after listening to the Vice Mayor, I'm kind of inclined to go the direction that he was talking about, where we would maximize the effect of this, if this is the way we're going to go. Reporting. Right, you had mentioned earlier reporting based on what were the metrics that you would want to track?
Yeah, so I haven't certainly vetted all these through yet, but we'd want to track crimes committed by juveniles. We would want to track juveniles who are victims of crimes. We certainly want to track how often we are utilizing this tool to get out with individuals. And that's something we've had some initial conversations with our IT staff on how we can track that. We want to make it easy for the officers because we don't want to create a ton more paperwork every time they do it, because that will discourage them from doing it, right? We want to make it easy for them to track, hey, I got out with this juvenile because it was a potential curfew violation, so we can see how often we're utilizing that. And what that'll also do is that'll show us, if we take those numbers, we got out with, let's just say in a 6-month period, we got out with 100 juveniles, right? Based on a potential curfew violation, and we only charged X, right? It will also help show the community that we're not taking this as a tool to just crush, every kid that's out there. We got out with X number, and we only charged X number with curfew violation. And there may be other metrics that we haven't completely thought through yet that could help us track that. We're certainly open to any suggestions that any of you, if you have something particular you want to look at.
So, and I've got some of those, and I'll go over them with you here in just a second. And then one of the other things that I see in here is when you look through, you've got violation of curfew, or paragraph B, C, then D, motor vehicle operators. It shall be unlawful for a person who is the owner or operator of any motor vehicle to knowingly permit, allow or encourage a minor to violate this section. Do you force it, because with that you have the ability to conduct a traffic stop if you see a minor in a vehicle, correct?
Yeah, so that's, yes, maybe. So the challenge with some of the language, right, is you're driving down the road, you certainly appear to be over 18. There is a juvenile in your car. I wouldn't say, and Ms. Harrison can certainly speak to this a little bit more, but I don't know that in and of itself gives me enough to stop you, because that could very well be your child, right? Mm-hmm. But if I've got a car full of what all appear to be young, and I mean, the story I keep going back to when we talk about this ordinance with other people I've shared this with is 3 weeks or so ago, we put out a press release where we arrested 7 individuals, 1 who was 18 and 6 who were at the time of the offense juveniles for a variety of crimes, including some gang-related activity. That's the type of thing, when you bring up that comment, that I think that would help with, right? Because to Bethany's point from earlier, we don't want to allow the language of this, which is why we tweaked it a little bit to say that 18-year-old gang members can just gather up as many juveniles as they want because they're 18 and they can be the parent, so to speak. So yeah, some of that's going to be a little bit challenging, and I don't know if Bethany has different thoughts on that. Certainly she can tell me that. But if a grandmother who's 70 is driving around with a car full of kids, I don't know that we're stopping that car, right? We're looking more again for that group or groups of individuals as opposed to an adult that's got, a clear adult that looks like they're a parent as opposed to an 18-year-old buddy.
And I think, speaking to that, probably the only place that I could see room for an exception would be, I wouldn't want to direct or order with the language of this to your officers that they shall conduct a traffic stop.
Correct.
Because traffic stops can be extremely dangerous.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the kind of looking through this, what I'm seeing, something that pops in my mind. So with that being said, you already mentioned one of them. It'd be interesting to obviously see, and I would personally like to see this monthly and published publicly, the component of it that we would be able to do for full transparency to the community on how this is being exercised. I would love to see, I'll wait. I see you're getting ready to take some notes.
I'm stealing Bethany's pen and paper both. So.
The number of stops, right? The number of actual encounters, I guess, would be what I would like to see. And then out of those encounters, a breakdown of how many juveniles and how many non-juveniles. Because if we're having these encounters and we're stopping folks, and then it turns out that 68% of them are 18 to 21, well, that's good information to have because it's probably not effective or as effective as it could be. Certainly would want to see the number of traffic stops if there were traffic stops involved. Number of use of force incidents that occur out of this. I think it would also be prudent for us to report to the community monthly the number of illegally possessed firearms that were seized, and also the types and quantities of drugs that were seized, because I think that if we were able to show things that were occurring, right, it's like I think the mayor mentioned, had we stopped, or maybe even the vice mayor was one of you two, I can't remember, but had we had the curfew in place and been able to stop whoever it was that murdered Kingston Campbell, seeing the impact of what's happening, right? So let's say this starts on Friday and July 1, let's evaluate. We've made 27 stops. We've seized 5 illegally possessed firearms, right? That would be very impactful to know, because that would be 5 legally possessed firearms that could not be used to murder somebody. That would come off the streets. So that's kind of where I'm thinking I'd like to see the reporting side of this. I think I discussed it with Ms. Harrison about potentially making that a component of the ordinance itself, requiring some sort of monthly report. I don't know if that's necessary, but I would really like to see that. I think that you guys have always been good on trying to put data and information out there for the community, and I think it just kind of gives everybody a stake in this. They see this is what our police department is doing, this is how it's being used, and this is what it's delivering. And then on the same side of that, if we're looking at it and we're tracking throughout, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, that's not really doing anything by looking at monthly reports, well, then we can turn around and repeal this thing before the sunset clause, right? Because it's not safe to increase encounters for your officers, right? Am I right about that? Like every time there's an encounter, there's a threat that comes with that.
We tell our folks that every encounter involves a gun because they have one on their hip, right?
Yeah.
So, and we
Yeah.
don't know how people are going to behave, so yeah.
So that's the other concern that I have too, is it's not the training or the professionalism of our police officers, but it's when you increase those encounters, you increase the likelihood of a use of force incident occurring, which is why that's something that I would like to see in that report. I think that would be important. So if there are use of force incidents occurring directly as a result of this curfew. That's something that we should know about and be tracking fairly quickly on, because anything that puts our officers at risk is something we should be paying attention to. Then I guess the next question I probably have would be for our Commonwealth's attorney, and it's specifically about the adding in paragraph B, subparagraph 8. I understand what the city attorney said about it. As far as passing constitutional muster goes, I get that. However, I am hanging out with Chris and Larry on the street corner, and we're all 16 years old. How is that not freedom of assembly?
Well, I've looked at the case that Mr. Freeman sent out, and I guess, in my reading of the case, they upheld the curfew, and it seemed like as a bonus, they're like, hey, you also have this language in here, that's great. The exceptions that you see enumerated in B, a number of them embody these First Amendment rights. You know, you're coming to and from a religious service, to and from a civic organization, or, you know, other activity. I mean, those are the freedoms of assembly there. And those are specific examples, but I think 8 just kind of gives a bigger umbrella, you know, this is the rights we're trying to protect here. But what was discussed in that case is that balance, you know. So the government can regulate, you know, First Amendment rights to a degree, but you have to pass certain constitutional muster here. Strict scrutiny is the highest, but they say with juveniles it's a little bit less for a number of reasons, really kind of outlined in the purposes that you have at the very beginning of the ordinance of what you're trying to aim at here. So, you know, to find some specific examples, maybe where that has perhaps happened in the case law, I could try to look for something like that, or maybe the city attorney is aware of some. I don't have any authority to give you right now to address that specific example. I just know those are the bigger ideas that we're dealing with here.
Because, and thanks for that, because kind of that's kind of the concern that I see. I get that, right? We want to make sure we have a good product that is going to pass the challenge test. So I understand that. But on the other side of that, when I look at that, you know, that would include protesting, right? Is a right to free speech, and right to assemble would be protesting. And personally, my peers may think differently, but I don't think my children, right, I don't think that they have a right to go protest after hours without my consent. And that's kind of the concern that I see with that, is if I don't want to necessarily create a loophole with it, and I see like you mentioned, the other things in here, there is freedom to assemble, there's freedom to exercise religion and so forth throughout the other exceptions. So I don't know. I kind of would like to see that subparagraph taken back out, really, because that just concerns me that somebody might be able to use that as a loophole, because if you have 3 people standing on a street corner, they can just look at you and say, I have a right to assemble. And on the other side of that, too, is going back to you, Chief, what happens when that is what is told to your officers based on the language of this? Because it explicitly states that, you know, if you've got 3 or 4 14-year-olds that look at you and say, well, we got a right to assemble, right? Does that put your officers in a gray area?
I think it does to some extent. I think, you know, and I'll not give the correct legal terms here. I'll rely on 2 lawyers to probably correct me. But, you know, I think it just has to pass a reasonableness test, right?
Yeah.
I think the reasonableness test there in your scenario, in my eyes anyways, if I was an officer dealing with that and it's 1 o'clock in the morning and I've got those 3 individuals you mentioned that are right to assemble, like I'd ask, or the 3 of you,
The 3 of us.
I would ask, what's your purpose? What are you protesting? What are you doing? Digging into that a little bit more. And I think if it doesn't pass the reasonableness test, I think that this ordinance could stand and could still be enforced, right? Now, different scenario if the three of you are all juveniles, right? And you're out there and you're with a group of, 400 who happen to be doing a midnight peace march or something like that, right? I think a different scenario, right?
Yeah.
Whether parents are there or not. But I think, some of those are going to be case-by-case basis. I certainly understand your concern with it. I would just argue that, a lot of times our officers have to look at kind of the reasonableness when they're trying to use their discretion on any ordinance, whether it's this ordinance or a variety of criminal offenses that they have discretion on currently. And, I trust them to make the best decisions they can, and we'll try and train them however this ordinance is passed. Obviously, we'll try and give them the best training they can get so they understand clearly what the expectation is of council and of our community as it relates to this.
Got it, and thank you for that. So, do you have any input on that?
I guess what I would add is there's an excerpt from the case I'd read. It says the First Amendment exception provides adequate notice to citizens. It is perfectly clear that core First Amendment activities such as political protests and religious worship after midnight would be protected. It is equally clear that rollerblading would not. Between these poles may lie marginal cases which can be taken as they come. So the idea, I think, is when the law enforcement officers are on the street looking at the circumstances, I think they can judge for themselves as to whether this would be something that would fall within core protected First Amendment activity. If they see him at a prayer vigil, they're probably not going to cite him for curfew violations. If they see him maybe beginning to start a fight in a group, they're probably going to get cited for curfew violations. So I guess that's what I would offer, and I think it is notable. Certainly, council, if you don't want that exception in there, it can come out. You can vote to exclude it as part of it, but I certainly would recommend it be in there, just because the court did on at least more than two occasions that I noted as I read through this, noted how it liked it, noted it of its importance. So that's all I have to offer on it.
And I think as long as, and I appreciate that, thank you. And if Ms. Harrison and Chief Zudema feel comfortable with that remaining in there and this still being able to be an effective tool for what we intend to do with it, I don't, we've got a laundry list of great exceptions because these are things that we want. If the youth in our city were engaged in these things after hours and these exceptions, right, I think we would have a lot less problems in the city that are listed here. So I think that these exceptions are great, and with such a list of exceptions, I'm inclined to change the language back to shall on the back end of this thing, because we're giving people, we're giving these children plenty of opportunities to have a valid reason to be out, and that's kind of where I'm at with this. So.
Anyone else? Councilman Hodges?
I like the may. The may gives the flexibility. The may is not, what we want to do is use this as a tool to stop the rise in juvenile violent gang activity. That's what we want it for. We want it just so somebody's out at 11:02 and you're now, because what happens, how people work, and I recognize how officers are going to work. They're going to say, it's 11:02 and I got to charge this guy. I got to bring him in. I got to do all this. No, that's not the purpose. The purpose is to try to give a tool that allows for a probable cause, that you now see a bunch of 15-year-old kids, your officers, they see them, they go, hey, there's problems here. Now you find the drugs, you find the guns, you find the things, then you charge. It's not like we're going to try to fund the budget by having a bunch of $250 or $500 fines on this thing. This is a matter of giving a tool that can find probable cause, give the discretion of the officers that can use this wisely and judiciously, and say, yeah, we're getting these people off the street that need to be off the street. We're not going to get people off the street that forgot their note because they're going to Sunday school class in the evening. So I like the May as well, and lots of these discussions are precisely why, and Ben Franklin was wise, and he said we always got to be wise balancing between safety and liberty. That's why there's a sunset clause in here that says 6 months, it's done. So if we start it, I think probably May 26th would give ample time as opposed to tonight, since it's going to be there. May 26th is a few days. It's when school gets done. It gives a few days for you to have this approved, and your officers can have at least a few days to understand what's happening with it. We have it sunset December 1st. We leave the class 3 because, again, it's, in 6 months, we say, it'd be a lot more effective if it was a class 3 or class 2. I think there's other issues that happen with a class 4 versus a class 3, not just the fine. I think it's elements of what goes on records and what does not. And then within that 6 months, it sunsets unless we say this was an effective tool. This helped keep our citizens safe. Let's do it again for another 6 months, but this time we're going to do it to 9:30, or we're going to do it to whatever time frame. At that time, you look at it and you institute or just let it lapse. So that's what I'd like to see this afternoon, or this evening, if we vote on it tonight.
Thank you. Dr. Wilder?
Yes, I like to also keep it as May. It gives the officer discretion, and I don't want to put the officer in a bad position where they got to just add more work to our officer. So I think the May gives you the flexibility you need, and you seem to be in favor of that as well as Commonwealth Attorney's Office seems to be in favor of the May. And I got a little confused. I want to say a little confused, excuse me. Make sure I'm clear. Is it class 4 or class 5? Because I've heard the thing says 4. Are we changing?
Class 4 is what it currently says.
Yes. So are we sticking with class 4? Okay. Yes. Okay. So make sure. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Councilman Dolan?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I would prefer we use the word may and leave it up to the discretion of the officer. I think they're capable of making those decisions on the spot, so that was my only comment.
Anyone else? Yeah, I would agree with May, and I like Councilman Helgeson's suggestion of, I'm comfortable with the 6-month sunset with the option of, if we see that it's working and it's successful and we see some good data, the potential of extending, because I think if we need more time, I think it's also worth reconsidering as well, because maybe we do need an additional 6 months to really get a full look at it. But no more questions? Thank you so much. We really appreciate you.
Doesn't need direction about putting it on for tonight.
Pardon?
Doesn't need direction for putting it on for tonight.
Yes, do you need direction?
There are a couple different things.
Okay.
So if I'm tracking the different opportunities, it's 6 months, keep May, keep the misdemeanor at 4, or not. So direction would help, and Mr. Freeman is very adept at making changes in preparation for this evening, but it would be helpful to kind of know where the collective are as far as what the ordinance should reflect.
Okay, so by consensus, keeping it with the word may. May is good, okay. 6-month sunset clause.
So not necessarily the 6 months, because if we started May 26th, which
Okay,
is the
so-
first day out of school,
To
December
December
1st,
1st.
so don't say 6 months, because we're
Okay.
going to be technical and have the dates, so to have
Right,
it
through
ends
December
December
1st.
1st.
December 1st.
December 1, starting May 26th. And would we like it to keep it a class 4 misdemeanor, or do we want to move it to a 3?
Madam,
Yeah, yes.
I would suggest that if we're going to be technical, that we should also probably start it at May 26th at 8 a.m., so that way it does not go into effect at midnight and people are unintended breaking the curfew the night before, essentially.
Okay.
So May 26th at 8 a.m.
May 26th, 8
Everybody's good
a.m.
with that?
till sunset on December 1st.
And then would obviously remove that, it shall become effective 10 days after. So we can't adopt it tonight and 10 days after, so that has to be stricken, of
Correct.
course.
And then a class 4 misdemeanor as the class 4, yes. Everybody good with that? Okay,
Got it.
Can I just say that I think that we need to have a strong messaging to the community so that they understand this well in advance.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I want to thank partners involved, Commonwealth's attorney, our police chief, Stephanie Meehan with court services, and a myriad of other department heads who really, Mr. Taylor and others that had asked us to kind of look at this. We did it pretty quickly, and support from the city attorney and others to kind of help give us feedback about the best ordinance or best resolution before you. I will say, as a resource coming out of that, there's so many things that we do for our youth in our city. Today in the newspaper, I don't know if you noticed that Lynchburg City Schools feeds youth during the summer and kind of gave you a schedule. There are many other things that I wasn't aware of in meeting with the I think Bethany reckoned, or the work session that we had with there had to have been at least 10, 15 people that were in there. And so we're going to get you a resource to kind of outlines all the different things, because we have information over here at Rex Park, we have information over here. So a resource as you are kind of entering the summer, if you have your constituents or others that have questions about what the city does for youth during the summer, we'll get you that. And then also this week, I wanted to highlight the mayor. Your group is meeting with Dr. Owen Carwell and some others to think about what the private side can do. I know that we looked at a couple different areas of our city that interest or that investment's needed. And there's resources in there. I know that I talked to Dr. Wilder, who has Jubilee, and we have Boys and Girls Club and some other things. So I think that'll be an exciting thing that'll out of Thursday's meeting with a group of people about other things that maybe our private sector can get involved with to help with this summer. So, Madam Mayor, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, and I will report back with whatever comes out of that meeting, hopefully some really good ideas and strategies. Did we want to go ahead and add the, this to the 7:30 agenda, just by motion of consensus? I'll be good with that, adding it to 7:30 for general business. Yes? Okay, wonderful. Moving on, and thank you, Mr. Benda, I appreciate that. Central Health Medical Campus, this item will appear before council for action on June 13th, 2023. Ms. Rachel Freshheisen.
Thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council. There we go. The purpose of this petition is to rezone 19 properties in the Langern and Tate Springs Road area to establish an IN2 Institutional 2 district for the Central Health Medical Campus, which would allow the expansion of the institution and its accessory uses by right. The subject properties include 19 tracts totaling approximately 100 acres. The properties are used by Centra Health and include Lynchburg General Hospital, Allen B. Pearson Cancer Center, Dawson Inn, and other uses that support the medical campus. If the rezoning is approved, the property would continue to be used for institutional uses and would allow for the expansion without the need for conditional use permits. You may recognize this site as the Holy Cross property. Revised properties were submitted after the Planning Commission meeting, and they relate to this property in particular. Those are outlined in your packet. It's identified as parcel 15. Centra has been able to actually partner with an adjoining property owner who is developing apartments on the property to the west. They will be sharing access to alleviate congestion at the intersection of Tate Springs and Langern Roads. So that particular proffer applies to this property only, making it IN2C Institutional 2 District conditional. The remainder of the properties would not be subject to this particular condition. Planning Commission recommended approval of the petition at their meeting on April 12th, and this item will return for a City Council public hearing at your June 13th meeting.
Wonderful, thank you. Any questions for Councilman Huggison?
I guess, first of all, my wife works for Centra, but she's a member of a group, and I can talk about this objectively. As I see this, and I see the institutional zoning, you know, I was on council when we came up with the institutional zoning, and this is vastly different than the whole purpose of the institutional zoning. You know, as you look at all the different items that are here with regarding the use of land, currently there's lots of different parcels. Tate Springs and Langern Road, B1, B3, R3, R4, high-density residential, lots of different other zoning designations currently. And we go back to the original impetus of why the institutional zoning came into being, was predominantly for Liberty University because their entire property was themselves. It was bordered by railroad tracks, US 460, US 29, major highways. All that property was within their footprint. So the concept of the institutional zoning said city or Liberty University doesn't have to go to the city every time they want to build another building. And that relieving that regulation really helped them to grow and thrive and build. They did have to comply with if stormwater comes off of their property onto the city, or traffic comes from their property onto the city's roads. Those were kind of things that needed to be, and that's why the industrial or the institutional zoning was granted. That's how it worked. This now I'm seeing it's in neighborhoods. There's lots of houses, there's residential, there's, I think as the iteration is now, I wouldn't be inclined to be voting for it because there's lots of little problems. I mean, when I heard the things earlier, I've heard from neighbors that were concerned about their neighborhood being demolished and turning into a 500 space parking lot. You give somebody just carte blanche authority on not just their particular property, but all the property that's within it, because it's vastly different. One was all by itself. The other is in a neighborhood, growing up within a neighborhood. So I think we got lots of challenges rather than just tacking on an industrial or institutional zoning on here. Because there's lots of properties. I've read through this list. There's tons of adjacent property owners. When we looked at the institutional zoning for Liberty, there was no adjacent property owners. I mean, other than US 460, I think, what's that? US 460, or is that a state highway? What is that? Huh? US 460. So, or the US 29, the railroad tracks. So you wouldn't see this laundry list of all these neighboring properties that could be affected or disaffected by this change. So I think we got some work on this one.
Thank you. Anyone else? Dr. Wilder?
Just to make sure I'm clear, is it the old Holy Cross property?
So that is included, it's one of 19 parcels that they are asking to rezone.
Okay, so it's several different ones.
Yes.
That's what I was messing up. Okay, I got you. All right, thank you.
Mr. Menda, yes.
And Mayor, to Councilman Hadwison's point, we've invited on June 13th. Obviously, this is a business item briefing, so it'll come back and there'll be ability to have a conversation. But I've asked Centra's CEO, Amy Carrier. I know that you've maybe read in the paper that the Centra's prepared to invest $500 million in their overall campus and some other things. And so I've asked her during her work session to engage on kind of their plans for Centra, and maybe during that conversation, she could also kind of reference some of this. So just stay tuned, if you will.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councilman Missions?
Yeah, so, kind of looking at this, and I've actually spoken with somebody that lives, hold on, I'm trying to pull it up here. On, what is it back there? Tate Springs, and when you get to the end of Tate Springs, is it Hillsdale, or? I'm trying to remember.
You can just chime in, Kent, so that.
I think it's Hillview.
Okay. So, there's a little residential neighborhood tucked in back there when you go past the hospital with a bunch of single-family homes. And I've talked to a couple of the folks that live back there, and I've got a lot of concerns about giving Centra basically the authority to just do as they please with the institutional zoning back there. Really have some concerns about that, because those folks moved into that neighborhood. They've been there many years. They didn't do it expecting to have a giant institution built around them. I know that there's been discussions about parking lots across the street and so forth. And when I look at this, we're talking about almost 30 acres. I just added it up off of this list of parcels that are currently zoned residential that they would like to make institutional, and I'm just not comfortable with that. In addition to that, when we look at, I know City Manager mentioned the $500 billion that they plan to invest, but what is the impact of that on our city and our resources as well? Because as the system grows, as the campus grows, there's going to be more of a demand. I know it's going to increase the number of fire alarms. It's going to increase the number of law enforcement responses. It's going to increase a significant amount of things over there on that campus. And, you know, when you look up Centra and the parcel viewer, they're one of the largest property owners in the city of Lynchburg that doesn't really provide any real estate tax to us. I know they provide a lot of things, a lot of jobs and things like that, but other hospital systems, other healthcare systems, they have their own police departments. They have their own ability to handle certain situations where right now we are the law enforcement agency having jurisdiction over Centra Health. And for them to expand their campus and then again, our responsibility to protect that and do other things with it. I'm just, something really isn't striking me as appropriate to just give them the authority to take all this land and do as they wish with it.
Thank you. I think it'll be good when Ms. Carrier gets here to probably answer a lot of these questions too. I think I recalled you telling me, Mr. Benda, that the new building, or the one over where Holy Cross is supposed to be, will be a taxable property. I do recall you saying that, but I think it'll be good when Ms. Carrier comes on the 13th. So thank you, Ms. Freshheisen. I appreciate you. Okay, moving on. Conditional use permit 5900 and 5906 Ford Avenue. This item will appear before council for action on June 13th. Oh, it's still you. Sorry. Ms. Freshheisen. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council. The purpose of this petition is to allow 31 apartments as part of a mixed-use development at 5900 and 5906 Ford Avenue. The property has been zoned B3, Community Business District, since 1978. The future land use map recommends community commercial uses for the property. The comprehensive plan states that residential uses may be established on upper floors of commercial structures or as transitional structures between residential and commercial buildings as appropriate. 5900 Fort contains a one-story structure constructed in 1955. The structure was most recently used as a carpet and flooring store. 5906 Fort Avenue is currently vacant. The proposed improvements should help revitalize the area and have an overall positive impact. Planning Commission recommended approval of the petition on April 12th, and again, this item will return for City Council public hearing on June 13th.
Thank you. Councilman Hudson.
Rachel, I'm reading this, it says in the, I guess, the Planning Commission meeting minutes, it says it's 7/10 of an acre?
That's correct.
Huh?
Yes.
So help me with the math here. 7/10 of an acre. A business and 31 apartments. I'm not in favor of this. I mean, it's.
And 31 parking spaces.
Yeah. Well, probably 64 or 62 parking spaces. What people would like if they have two cars or whatnot. Holy smokes, this is all adjacent to a residential, single-family neighborhood. Yeah, I've read the minutes. I talked to our newest planning commissioner who lives over there, and you know, bending the rules, even to a, you know, where the CUP requirement is a 50-50, this is going to a 70-30, having 31 units, a business, parking spaces, as the vice mayor stated, and 31 apartments. I think we got enough here.
Anyone else? Vice Mayor Faraldi?
I think Councilman Eggleston articulated some of the concerns I had. I also found it interesting that within this development, there's the requirement that each unit only have one vehicle. And I'm like, how do we as the governing body enforce that? How does the
Right.
property enforce that? I mean, like, you know, and then on top of that, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, please do, it's also the same parking as also for the commercial property?
So you're correct that the petitioner stated that it would be one car per apartment. That wasn't a condition
Sure.
that we were adding, just to clarify that. And yes, so they felt that the the overlap between the commercial use and the parking that would be available during the day when many residents, not all, but many residents are at work or out and about, would allow for the shared parking. And our zoning ordinance does allow for, during the technical review committee, the site plan process, when they would have to establish what commercial use it is, if they can demonstrate that at max capacity, you would be able to, that it would be sufficient, they are allowed to do that, but they have to demonstrate that.
Yeah, I think overall my biggest concern with this is the, in this situation, we're gonna allow a different balance of commercial to residential, and then the impact of the parking. One of the commissioners, I forget who it was, but I highlighted it, one of the commissioners cited, you know, if we approve this here, we're gonna have to approve it in other areas, and so I think when it comes to development, we need more housing, we need more affordable housing, we need more development, business, yep, I'm all on board. And yet 7/10 of an acre comes out to be like, what, 30-something thousand square feet maybe, and another 30 parking spaces of that is taken. I just, you know, we need more housing, absolutely, but it's gotta be in the right spot. And we need to follow our own policies. Otherwise, we're opening ourselves up to issues if we don't approve another one that is a similar situation.
Anyone else?
Just maybe another quick question. So I threw that out there but then I grabbed my calculator. So our high-density residential, how many units per acre is that normally? Like 20?
I want to say it's
15?
It's 20 and change, 20,
Yeah,
you're
20 and
testing
change.
it.
This one works out to 44,
Correct.
not even including the business. So,
And I was wrong, colleagues, it's 30,492 square feet. No, that's it.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right, moving on. The draft annual action plan, community development block grant, and home program. This item will appear before council for action on June 13th, 2023. Mr. Tom Martin.
Good evening. Madam Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council. The annual action plan is required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it outlines the needs, goals, and objectives of community development for housing and non-housing goals. The Community Action Plan indicates the Community Development Advisory Committee's recommendations to council for community development block grant and home funds, which were approved by council on April the 25th. So essentially what this is a report to HUD indicating the projects, how that funding will be allocated, and what need is being met. The required public comment period for the action plan began on May 11th and will continue until June the 13th after the public hearing.
Okay, great. Any questions? No?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, moving on. Virginia Department of Health Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Fiscal Year 2022 Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Lead Service Line Inventory Funding. This item will appear before council for action on June 13th, 2023. Mr. Tim Mitchell.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council. So in December 16, 2021, EPA passed a new revision to the lead and copper rule, which dictates how we manage our lead service lines primarily. One of the provisions and requirements of that is that we do a citywide inventory of all public and private side service lines. So we have to determine whether and what the material is on public and private lines throughout the city. And so the Virginia Department of Health has this funding opportunity to allow us to basically extend our capital and reduce their cost of capital to do that inventory. So basically this is a loan at an interest rate of 1% and then $190,000 in principal forgiveness. The original offer letter had the loan amount at $310,000, but in talking to the Virginia Department of Health and the Virginia Resource Authority, that loan could be increased to some higher amount. And right now, we have a contract with AECOM, a consulting engineering firm that's been working with us over the past year to work on the service line inventory. So they've been going through a lot of our old records that are 100 years old or older, up to current records that we have to identify what the service material is. And their contract with them is $734,000 to do that work. And we have a deadline to complete that work of October 16, 2024. So this loan and principal forgiveness could actually repay some of the funding that we've already expended on the inventory that we're required to do, so it would lower that cost of capital. And I'll be glad to answer any specific questions. This will be before council at the public hearing on June 13th. And again, I'll be glad to answer any questions related to this.
Thank you so much. Anyone have any questions? Councilman Helgeson?
I guess just anytime I see the EPA coming out with yet some other mandate, I really, just kind of take umbrage. I'm sure there's probably some good ideas or good thoughts, but every other day you see that gas stoves are being outlawed. You recognize, if you're anybody who's bought a washing machine recently, that sometimes they can't have an agitator. They can't have, so you can't clean the clothes. You can't even put water in your washing machine to actually clean the clothes. I mean, I had an old washing machine that worked fantastic, and the EPA came out with all sorts of new guidelines. We had to go through every kind of hoop to buy a new washing machine. So if you have a washing machine, find a Maytag repairman that can keep that rascal going, because these people are nuts. I mean, the things that you now have to, it's like flushing a toilet. They came out with the toilet, how much water can be used. And so how many times do we flush it? 3 times, 2 times, whatever. Did it save anything? No. Some bureaucratic pinhead in Washington thought this was a fine thing. And so I hope this isn't another, but I'm going to be holding my breath, because when we're now saying every line has to be tested, whether it be government or private, with regarding copper or something, I believe you said?
It's lead. It's
Copper
primarily
and lead.
lead, but we have to identify and make public the
Anyway.
materials for all the.
So I recognize you're keeping compliance with it, so I'm not, but I just, again, these agencies were not designed, these regulatory agencies weren't the ones that were designed to write law. They weren't designed to adjudicate law. They weren't designed to enforce the law. That was the congressional legislative branch of government. That's the executive branch of government. It wasn't all supposed to be in one regulatory body. So anyway, I recognize this is different, but I said my piece and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Councilman Taylor?
So all the homes with the old galvanized pipes will have to be removed.
So it's a complicated rule, because lead service line, lead and copper rule is very old, but they've done this update and made these new requirements. They're also in the process of updating it again to make even more requirements. One of the requirements is that we're going to have to do lead testing in all schools and all daycare facilities coming up. But the galvanized lines, if the other thing that we have to determine is, if we haven't found any lead service lines on the private side so far. We have found lead service lines on the public side that were installed back in the 1900s, 1930s, early 1900s. If there's ever a galvanized line that was connected to a lead line on the customer side, that galvanized line also would have to be replaced. So we're trying to go back and identify where we've removed lead lines in the past and determine if there was ever a galvanized line connected to the lead line that we removed. Those lines are also flagged as needing to be replaced.
So 30 years later, the lead is in those pipes.
30 years later, the lead's still potentially in the galvanized lines, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right. And last, we have the ANCH LLC franchise ordinance. This Item will appear before council for action on June 27th, 2023. Mr. Lee Newland.
Yes, Madam Mayor, Vice Mayor. The purpose of this is to review a proposal of a franchise agreement to allow an ADA ramp in the right-of-way of Bedford Avenue. The property is at 2204 Bedford Avenue and is being redeveloped along with other parts of Bedford Avenue. It's trying to make the property ADA compliant. The developer, ANCH LLC, has asked the city to allow them to install this ramp within the right-of-way. The developers worked with the city to get the required dimensions for both the ramp and for the sidewalk. And the project is like I said, a part of the ongoing revitalization of Bedford Avenue. And this will have to come back as a franchise ordinance is required for them to be able to use the right-of-way.
Wonderful.
There are some pictures of the ramp that is already installed along both the frontage of the building and side view looking at it. This has been will be advertised for public hearing on twice, 2 different dates, and then it'll come back to the June 27th work session to receive bids for the franchise agreement, and then it will be at the at the 27th regular meeting for a public hearing. Then after the public hearing, council will vote on the ordinance.
Okay, thank you so much. Anybody have any questions? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
All right, now we'll move on to roll call. Dr. Wilder.
Again, I want to thank all the ones that came out to the basketball tournament, charity tournament, in memory of the 6-year-old that passed away, Kingsley. We had an event to raise funds for his family. They had about 18 teams, and so is how we have such a caring community that came out, raised over $2,000 that we gave to the family. So I want to thank all the persons coming out to support the family. Also want to congratulate also our mayor for having, in the Mayor's Youth Council, for having a car wash on Saturday for Parkview Missions. It was a great success. I didn't make it, so whoever did make it, I encourage you to make a donation to Parkview Missions. It was a great organization, so we appreciate that. And also, on a kind of a sad note, one of the coaches that was at the event on Monday and Tuesday, he had a procedure on Wednesday. He passed on Thursday. Rodney Spinner, he was 45 years old, a great coach in our community. His funeral was at our church. Our church holds about 500-600. It was like 700 people. Well, I won't tell them farm marshal, but it was standing room only with purses in our balcony. So again, just shows how a great, caring coach he was. He was a coach, he was a mentor, only 45 years old, but he was a great man in our community. So we're going to continue to pray for his family. But it just shows how our community comes together in time of tragedy or in times of need to support his wife and support his kids as well. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Councilman Dolan? Councilman Huddleston?
Thank you. Yeah, this last week was fantastic to see Liberty's graduation. 60,000 people come to the campus. They fill up our restaurants and bring in lots of money in meals tax and pay our servers and pay the restaurants, fill up the hotels. Fantastic. Having several days, I got to see lots of my former students that now have graduated. Just a wonderful message. The school was clean and well-received and a fantastic event that just went, basically without a hitch. So excellent fireworks at the end, and just congratulate all those recent graduates. Hopefully in this crazy Biden recession, we're not going to be, they'll be able to get jobs. So I'm hopeful for that, so.
All right, thank you. Councilman Mischins?
I think that I've stated this before, and I'm going to say it again. I think that we really need to figure out what we need to do to find the funds to appoint an auditor for the city of Lynchburg. Just doing a little bit of research on my own, I found that that would actually also be the best way to protect people within the workforce and the school division from having their identities disclosed if they were to come forward with legitimate complaints of waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think that that should be a priority moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Taylor?
Yes, have you all heard of the Raven football team? Yes, it's a youth football team here in Lynchburg. They practice. They asked us, council, and to find them a place where they can practice with lights. These young men, they have to hold to a 3.0 GPA in order to play. And that you're gonna meet their coaches here pretty soon. They're gonna come down and introduce themselves to us, but they have to hold to a 3.0 GPA in order to play the football. And they travel. It's a traveling football team. They up in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Tennessee, and they are our youth. So we need to help them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Feroldi?
No items.
Okay. All right. During my tenure as mayor, I intend to acknowledge the work of each of our fantastic city departments. The city manager proposed acknowledging our departments alphabetically, and the next one on the list is our Department of Community Development. The Department of Community Development works with city council, residents, businesses, and institutions to shape the growth of Lynchburg. The department's employees are constantly searching for the yes within the context of our community's values and laws to promote development, code compliance, and strategic investment. Did you know that the department issues, on average, 1,200 development permits and performs over 13,000 construction inspections annually, which facilitated over $180 million in real property investment last year? In addition, community development works with neighbors to enhance the safety, investment, and quality of life in their neighborhoods. City staff help resolve approximately 300 overgrown lots, inoperable vehicles, trash, and zoning violations annually with a 75% voluntary success rate. Last year, that same inspection team also conducted over 1,500 housing and rental inspections, which resulted in the repair of 360 unsafe structures and managed a caseload of over 500 vacant and derelict buildings. The department frequently engages with residents to identify and chart solutions for a variety of neighborhood issues in tandem with its management of over $1 million in federal grant funding each year. Community development staff support 5 appointed boards and commissions, as well as provide recommendations to City Council on land use matters. Residents can track zoning petitions, development reviews, inspections, permit, and case information anytime through the city's online portals. City staff also still welcome phone calls, emails, and walk-in clients. So thank you very much. And as Dr. Wilder said earlier, we did, earlier this school year, the Mayor's Youth Council volunteered at Parkview Community Mission, helping to distribute groceries to our food insecure families with their Food for Families program. The experience really resonated with the kids so much that they requested to hold a fundraiser specifically benefiting Parkview Community Mission. So this past Saturday, they did just that. In partnership with the Lynchburg Fire Department, the Mayor's Youth Council held a donation-led car wash at Fire Station 6, raising over $4,000. I'm so proud of this group for being civic-driven leaders and working together for the betterment of our community. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to give a very special thanks to all of our friends at Station 6, especially Captain Anthony Andrews and firefighters Kendall Moyer, Trayor Benefield, and Jacob Adkins for their efforts in helping to make this a reality, and all of our neighbors who came out to support us. Thank you very much. We will now go into consideration of a closed session to discuss the procedures and results of a City Adult Protective Services investigation and court proceeding pursuant to Section 2.2-3711A4 and through A8 and A16 of the Code of Virginia, 1950 as amended. Consideration of a closed meeting to discuss and consider information relating to a proposal for a city highway road project submitted pursuant to the city via the Public-Private Transportation Act of 1995, pursuant to 2.23705.611 and 2.2-37116 of the Code of Virginia, 1950 as amended, and consideration of a closed meeting to discuss appointments for vacancies to the Lynchburg Regional Airport Commission pursuant to Section 2.2-3711A1 of the Code of Virginia, 1950 as amended. May I? Thank you. Okay, go ahead and cast your vote. All right, we're now in closed session.